Picture a face carved in solid stone by royal command, meant to be seen by an entire civilization for the rest of time. Now picture that face with a skull stretched backward like soft clay, a belly that sags over the waistband, hips wider than the queen standing beside it. That isn't vandalism. Hat isn't a damaged statue. That's exactly how this king ordered himself to be shown. And for 3,000 years, almost nobody wanted to talk about what that actually meant. This is the story of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who tore apart Egypt's religion, vanished into the desert to build a city for a single god, and left behind a body of art so strange that historians spent a century arguing about whether it was symbolism, propaganda, or something written into his actual bones. And it's the story of how a sealed laboratory in Cairo, two competing teams of geneticists, and a handful of brittle, 3,000-year-old bones finally settled an argument that stone carvings alone could never answer. What they found didn't just identify one mummy. It rewrote the ending of an entire dynasty, and it explained, in cold genetic terms, why the most famous face in the ancient world was hiding a body that could barely stand. Start with what everyone thinks they know. For most of the 20th century, the public image of an Egyptian pharaoh was fixed. Square jaw, broad chest, perfect posture, a living god carved exactly the way a god was supposed to look. That image existed for almost 2,000 years before Akhenaten, and it returned the moment he died. He is the single, jagged exception in the middle of it, and the strangest part is that the exception wasn't hidden in some forgotten tomb. It was broadcast, carved into temple walls, repeated on stelae, stamped onto household shrines, displayed in the new capital he built from nothing, an elongated head, a protruding stomach, thin, almost fragile limbs attached to a torso with feminine curves. If a modern sculptor handed in work like that to please a king obsessed with his own divinity, you'd assume they'd lose their job, or worse. Instead, those proportions appear to have been demanded. To understand why, you have to understand what this king did to the entire religious structure of his country, because the body and the revolution are tangled together. Around 1353 BCE, a young pharaoh born Amenhotep IV inherited a kingdom built on a vast, ancient bureaucracy of gods. Amun-Ra sat at the top of that system, served by a priesthood so wealthy and so entrenched that it rivaled the throne itself in influence. Temples owned farmland, workshops, granaries, and tens of thousands of laborers. The priesthood didn't just worship the king. In many ways, it created him, legitimizing his rule through ritual and providing the religious machinery that kept the entire kingdom functioning day to day. Then this king did something no predecessor had attempted. He moved against that machinery directly. Temple estates were confiscated, endowments were stripped away, thousands of priests in temple. Workers lost their positions, seemingly overnight. Ancient festivals that had run for centuries were canceled. He erased his own birth name from monuments across the kingdom, since it carried the name of a moon inside it, and replaced it with Akhenaten, a name that translated roughly to effective for the sun disk. The sun disk itself, the Aten, became the only deity that mattered. No animal-headed gods, no crowded pantheon of overlapping deities controlling separate aspects of life and death. Just one radiant disk in the sky, its rays ending in small, carved hands that reached down to touch only the king and his immediate family. Ordinary citizens were locked out entirely. There was no direct path to this god for a farmer or a soldier. The only door left open ran through the pharaoh himself. Then he abandoned the capital. Thebes, with its dense network of temples, royal tombs, and centuries of religious infrastructure, was left behind. Akhenaten marched the court north into open desert and carved 14 boundary markers into the cliffs, fixing the limits of a brand new city called Akhetaten, built around devotion to the Aten and nothing else. It rose astonishingly fast, in less than 2 years, with wide-open courts designed to catch direct sunlight rather than hide from it, the opposite of the dim, secretive sanctuaries that had defined Egyptian temple architecture for generations. Imagine living through that as an ordinary person. The temple your family depended on for grain and work is suddenly shuttered. The festivals that marked the rhythm of your year are gone. The priests who manage daily religious life are unemployed and furious. That kind of resentment doesn't evaporate, it waits. But here's the detail almost nobody focuses on when telling this story. The religious revolution wasn't the most shocking thing happening in that new city. The body was. There's a fragment of an inscription, preserved in broken limestone, recording an instruction given to Akhenaten's artists. Stop idealizing the king, it essentially says. Show him as he actually is, flesh and bone, not as some flawless warrior god. And what those artists produced next has no precedent anywhere in 3,000 years of Egyptian art. Elongated skulls stretched backward, narrow sloping shoulders, hips that flare out wider than most queens of the era, soft, rounded bellies spilling over the royal kilt, long, spindly fingers, faces that blur every visual signal Egyptian art had always used to separate male royal bodies from female ones. And the stylistic break went far beyond just the king. The entire art movement loosened up. For 2,000 years, Egyptian relief carving had been rigid, formal, frozen in eternal stiff profiles. Suddenly figures were shown bending, leaning, embracing. The royal family appears holding hands, kissing their children, slumping casually under the heat of the sun. In one striking scene, they're shown gathered in open, unguarded grief around the body of a dead daughter, a level of private emotional vulnerability no pharaoh had ever allowed onto a temple wall before. Scholars often call this period the Amarna style, named after the modern term for the abandoned city, and it remains some of the most intimate art the ancient world ever produced. What makes it impossible to dismiss as a passing artistic fad is who else shares that same unusual body. Nefertiti, his queen, is shown with the same elongated skull and pronounced jaw. Their daughters carry the same proportions, generation after generation, as though one physical signature had been stamped through the entire bloodline. Foreign diplomats arriving at the Egyptian court, expecting the imposing, idealized pharaoh described in earlier treaties and letters, reportedly left baffled by what they actually witnessed. And that repetition across the family is the single clue that would matter most, 3,000 years later, to a completely different kind of investigator. One unusual-looking individual can be written off as artistic license, illness, or simple eccentricity. But a physical trait that recurs across parent, child, and grandchild, the same signature appearing again and again, is exactly the kind of pattern a geneticist is trained to recognize. Nobody standing in that ancient workshop understood what they were documenting. They were simply carving what stood in front of them, generation after generation, leaving the evidence in plain sight on stone that would outlast their entire civilization. For decades, Egyptologists argued over what that evidence actually meant. Some insisted it was purely symbolic, the king visually claiming both male and female creative power as part of his new theology. Others called it political theater, a deliberate visual break designed to sell a radical new religion. A smaller, more persistent group kept asking an uncomfortable question. What if it was simply accurate? The answer to that question didn't come from another temple wall. It came from a body. In 1907, archaeologists opened a tomb in the Valley of the Kings that excavators would spend the next century arguing about. Catalogued as KV-55, the burial was a mess, deliberately so. The coffin had been mutilated. Cartouches identifying the occupant had been scratched out. The gilded face on the mask had been torn away. In a culture where your name surviving in stone was the literal mechanism for eternal life, this wasn't simple looting. Someone had gone out of their way to erase this person from existence in the next world, which is one of the most aggressive acts of religious punishment imaginable in ancient Egyptian belief. But the skeleton inside refused to stay anonymous. A long, narrow skull, a jawline matching the carved Amarna portraits, a slender build consistent with that unmistakable artistic style. For decades, that resemblance fueled a furious academic standoff, because identifying this body correctly would mean finally testing every wild theory about Akhenaten's strange anatomy against real physical evidence. The problem was that the bones gave contradictory signals depending on who examined them. Several specialists, using standard skeletal aging techniques, were confident the man had died. In his 20s, decades too young to match the known length of Akhenaten's reign. Others argued just as forcefully that those aging methods are notoriously unreliable on remains this fragmentary and this old. The standoff dragged on for the better part of a century, with respected researchers staring at identical fragments and reaching opposite conclusions. Meanwhile, medical theories about Akhenaten's odd proportions kept piling up and collapsing. Marfan syndrome was proposed, then challenged. Froehlich's syndrome was floated. Some suggested gynecomastia, or an unspecified hormonal disorder originating in the pituitary gland, possibly triggered by a tumor or an old head injury. Others dismissed the whole debate, insisting the art was pure ideology and the king had probably looked entirely ordinary. 100 years of careful measurement with calipers and rulers could not settle it. Eventually, the argument moved somewhere those ancient priests could never have imagined it would end up. A sealed, sterile laboratory in Cairo, where DNA itself would be asked to testify. Before this project even began, there was enormous reason to expect it would fail outright. DNA is a fragile molecule. Heat destroys it. And an Egyptian tomb, sealed for thousands of years in a desert climate, functions essentially like a slow oven. Earlier attempts to extract usable genetic material from mummified remains had been publicly mocked, frequently dismissed as nothing more than modern contamination from the archaeologists and conservators who had handled the bodies over the decades. Plenty of serious scientists doubted that anything reliable could be recovered from material this old and this compromised. So every safeguard the research team eventually built into the study existed to answer one brutal question. They knew would come the moment results were published. How can you prove this is genuinely ancient DNA and not simply your own? Getting that wrong wouldn't just embarrass one paper. It would hand critics a talking point that could discredit ancient DNA research in Egypt for a generation. So the team, led by Egyptologist Zahi Hawass alongside geneticist Yehi Agad, spent roughly 2 years just designing a study rigorous enough to survive that level of scrutiny. 11 royal mummies were selected for testing, including Tutankhamun, the defaced occupant of KV-55, and an unidentified woman known only by the working title, the Younger Lady, whose face had also been deliberately smashed by someone who clearly wanted her erased as well. Each mummy moved through the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization under a strict, documented chain of custody. Samples were pulled specifically from teeth and dense bone because genetic material tends to survive there far longer than in soft tissue, which decays or is destroyed during the mummification process itself. These 11 individuals weren't chosen at random. They spanned roughly 3 generations of the royal family, selected precisely because their relationships to Akhenaten were either documented, quietly suspected by historians, or flatly denied by tradition. The plan was to lay the entire family tree out at the molecular level and let the genetic evidence settle, disputes that inscriptions alone couldn't resolve. If the written record and the biological record disagreed, the biology would win, and nobody on the team could predict in advance whether the two would even tell the same story. Every precaution was built around assuming contamination until proven otherwise. Each sample was processed inside a sterile, clean room, alongside empty control samples, designed to catch any trace of modern DNA. If a control came back contaminated, the entire batch was discarded and the work restarted, sometimes after weeks of effort. Then came the most important safeguard. 2 separate laboratories analyzed the same material independently, each working from blind sample codes, with neither lab told which mummy it was testing or what conclusions the other lab was reaching. Only results that matched across both labs were accepted as valid. Colleagues who worked alongside Gad during this period have described him pausing with a sample tube in hand before loading it into the sequencer, almost as if he wanted the remains inside to know they were being handled with care. The team analyzed 3 separate genetic markers, each revealing a different angle of the family tree. Mitochondrial DNA, passed only from mother to child, traced the maternal line. Y chromosome markers, passed only from father to son, traced the paternal line. And a panel of autosomal microsatellite markers provided the statistical power to distinguish a parent from a sibling from a cousin with real mathematical confidence. 3 independent lines of evidence pointed at the same family, rather than relying on a single fragile thread. In 2010, the full methodology and underlying data were published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, openly available for any skeptic to scrutinize. When both laboratories finally reported back, the family tree those numbers drew was not the one most people in that room had hoped to see. Start with the part of the finding that drew the least controversy. The genetic data linked 3 of the 11 mummies into an extremely tight family unit. KV-55 was identified as the father. The Younger Lady was identified as the mother, and Tutankhamun was their son. The man inside that deliberately defaced coffin emerged as the strongest genetic candidate for Akhenaten himself. A royal father, a royal mother, a royal heir, exactly what a dynasty is structurally built to produce. Then the researchers looked 1 generation further back, at the parents of KV-55 and the Younger Lady, and that's where the study became genuinely explosive. The genetic markers showed that KV-55 and the Younger Lady shared the same mother and the same father. Not half siblings, which this dynasty had practiced for generations without much controversy. Full siblings, 2 children of the exact same parents, raised inside the same palace, eventually married to one another, who together produced the boy who would later be buried in a solid gold mask. It's worth sitting with why that result stopped the room cold. These were researchers who had spent years bracing themselves for unusual findings. Royal intermarriage in this dynasty was well documented and expected. What nobody had fully prepared for was discovering exactly how close that intermarriage actually was. A genetic pedigree this tight forced a single uncomfortable conclusion into a room full of career Egyptologists and geneticists. And for a moment, nobody particularly wanted to be the one to say it plainly. That finding instantly reframed the most photographed object in the history of archaeology. The golden mask, the symbol that draws millions of visitors into museums every year, was no longer simply the treasure of a dynasty at the height of its power. It was, genetically speaking, the product of a brother and a sister, a child carrying the compounded biological cost of generations of deliberate intermarriage, inside a body that would betray him before he reached 20. It's important to be precise here. This was the conclusion of 1 landmark study built on careful methodology, not an unchallengeable verdict closed off from all future debate. Some Egyptologists still dispute the exact identifications around the edges, and ancient DNA research continues to evolve as techniques improve. But for the first time, a royal family tree had been reconstructed from molecules rather than reconstructed purely from flattering inscriptions and political propaganda, and the molecular picture was considerably harsher than the carved one. And suddenly, those bizarre Amarna statues made a different kind of sense. The wide hips, the stretched skull, the soft, sagging torso the artists had been explicitly ordered to carve. Maybe that wasn't religious symbolism after all. Maybe it wasn't a deliberate artistic rebellion either. Maybe it was simply biology, surfacing in plain sight on the walls of a brand new capital, the visible result of recessive genetic damage finally breaking through after generations of concentration inside one bloodline. If Akhenaten's body was the early warning sign, his son's body was the bill coming due. And that bill arrived in devastating detail once researchers turned modern medical imaging on Tutankhamun's own remains. The golden mask is so flawless it fooled the world for nearly a century. The body sealed beneath it tells an entirely different story. CT scans capable of mapping bone structure down to fractions of a millimeter revealed a severely clubbed left foot, with bones rotated and shortened and tendons tightened from birth, making a normal, pain-free gait essentially impossible from his very first steps. The damage extended further. One toe was missing a bone entirely, a congenital absence doctors still associate with children born to closely related parents. Bone tissue inside parts of his feet had actually died while he was still a teenager, starved of adequate blood supply by a body that couldn't distribute weight evenly across damaged joints. His spine showed signs of curvature, and the roof of his mouth was affected by a cleft palate, a condition no ancient physician possessed the surgical skill to correct, which likely affected his speech, complicated eating, and left him chronically vulnerable to infection. While his skeleton was quietly failing him, the official propaganda machine never missed a beat. Temple and tomb walls from his reign depict a vigorous young pharaoh charging into battle, drawing a bow from a moving chariot, hunting lions on the run, locked into the same triumphant warrior pose every pharaoh before him had claimed. Not a single official image hints at a limp, a cane, or a body in genuine distress. The gap between the boy shown on those walls and the boy preserved in that coffin is almost impossible to reconcile, because a divine king who couldn't walk unaided across his own throne room was a politically dangerous truth for any kingdom to admit publicly. So the artists drew him whole, and that fiction outlived him by 3,000 years. Inside his tomb, archaeologists recovered more than 100 walking sticks. Some were plain wood, others crafted from gold or electrum, a few even carved with images of his enemies positioned beneath his feet so that every step symbolically crushed them. Many show clear wear right at the handle, exactly where a young man's palm would press down for genuine physical support, not ceremonial display. These weren't royal scepters meant purely for ritual. They were mobility aids he depended on, simply to move through his own palace. Then ancient DNA delivered one final devastating detail. Genetic material recovered from his remains tested positive for Plasmodium falciparum, the most lethal strain of malaria, and not from a single infection. The evidence pointed to repeated bouts, with the most recent infection still active in his bloodstream at the time of his death, striking an immune system already weakened by everything he'd inherited genetically. Picture the full shape of that short life. A boy crowned before the age of 10, ruling the most powerful nation on earth, draped in gold and surrounded by a court that needed him to look every inch a living god, while privately enduring near-constant physical pain, unable to walk without assistance, trapped inside a body failing him in almost every measurable way. Tutankhamun died at roughly 19, undone by congenital deformities, bone tissue slowly destroying itself, and a tropical disease his weakened system had little capacity left to fight, which raises the real question underneath all of this. The mystery was never really about what was wrong with one unlucky teenager. It's about how a family this powerful kept producing children this medically compromised, generation after generation, entirely on purpose. Because this wasn't bad luck, it was policy. Royal Egypt didn't stumble into close intermarriage by accident. It was deliberate, formalized, and considered sacred. The belief system held that the pharaoh's bloodline carried a literal spark of divinity, and that introducing outside blood, even from another noble Egyptian family, risked corrupting the cosmic order the king was supposed to embody. A royal sister wasn't simply an acceptable marriage option. In many cases, she was considered the only womb pure, enough to carry the next divine heir. Half-sibling marriages had already been common for generations across the broader dynasty by this point. Full sibling marriages were rarer, but never forbidden, and every time the family repeated the practice, they unknowingly raised the statistical odds of genetic disease, a risk no priest of that era had any way of detecting, but one that modern bone scans can now measure with disturbing clarity. To them, none of this looked like danger. It looked like devotion. Royal inscriptions describe the bloodline as a living thread holding back cosmic chaos, something that had to be protected from outside contamination at almost any cost. In their worldview, diluting that blood wasn't a minor social compromise, it was a genuine threat to the stability of the universe itself. So the theoretically safest heir was the child born from the purest possible union, a king and his own sister. Modern population genetics quantifies exactly why that belief was so dangerous. Two unrelated parents face roughly a 3% baseline risk of a serious recessive genetic disorder in their child. Two full siblings face something closer to 25%, a full 1 in 4 chance. Repeat that pattern across generations and the danger compounds, concentrating the same hidden mutations until a child eventually inherits 2 damaged copies of the same gene from both parents at once. Everyone carries a handful of silent genetic flaws that caused no harm paired with a healthy copy from the other parent. Marry a stranger, and a healthy copy almost always compensates. Marry your own sibling, and you're both drawing from a nearly identical genetic deck. And the truly cruel part of this pattern is how invisible it stays until it isn't. One brother-sister pairing might easily produce a perfectly healthy child, and the priests of that era would have read that outcome as proof the bloodline remained strong and the gods remained satisfied. But every additional repetition quietly loaded the genetic dice further until the damage eventually surfaced visibly in twisted feet, cleft palates, and elongated skulls. They believed they were concentrating divine power inside their bloodline. In biological reality, they were concentrating disease. Akhenaten's unusual proportions were the first visible alarm bell, the earliest royal body unable to fully hide what had been quietly accumulating inside the family line for generations. His son's failing feet and weakened immune system were the bill finally arriving in full. After Tutankhamun's death, there was no surviving direct heir left to take the throne at all. Power passed instead to Ai, an elderly court official, without any directive. Blood claimed to royalty, and then to Horemheb, a military commander with no royal blood whatsoever. The same dynasty that had once ruled an empire stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates under conquerors like Thutmose and Amenhotep, the Magnificent, ended with a teenager who couldn't cross his own throne room without a cane. That collapse explains why later generations didn't simply move on from Akhenaten's memory, they actively went back to attack it. His name was chiseled out of monuments across the kingdom. His statues were toppled and buried in pits. His abandoned capital was deliberately dismantled and surrendered back to the desert sand. He was left off official king lists entirely, as though the throne had somehow skipped over his existence altogether. For generations afterward, he survived in cultural memory mainly as an insult, referred to obliquely as the criminal of his own city, a man considered too dangerous to even name directly. And there's a genuine irony sitting at the center of all of it. The exact practice this dynasty believed was protecting and purifying its sacred bloodline turned out to be the very thing slowly poisoning it from the inside. Every marriage designed to keep royal power concentrated and pure, quietly, made the next generation a little weaker, a little sicker, and a little less physically capable of holding onto the throne they were destroying themselves trying to preserve. By the time that warning had been carved into Akhenaten's own unusual body, it was already far too late for anyone in that era to read it correctly. The strange face on those temple walls was never an artistic accident or a clever political statement. It was simply the truth, eventually forced out into the open by genetics, by bone density scans, and finally by a sealed laboratory in modern Cairo. The most powerful royal dynasty in ancient history didn't fall to an invading army, a famine, or a popular uprising. It eroded slowly from the inside, one carefully arranged royal marriage at a time, until there was no viable heir left standing to claim the crown at all. The man on the throne was the early warning. The boy buried beneath the golden mask was the proof. And the next time you see that mask in a textbook or behind museum glass, it's worth remembering that the perfection staring back at you was deliberately built to hide exactly how broken the boy wearing it really was. So here's the question worth sitting with after all of this. Knowing what we now know about that bloodline, do you think the priests who erased Akhenaten's name from history actually understood what they were destroying, or were they simply terrified of a king too strange to explain? Drop your theory in the comments because this dynasty's bones still have more to say.